had always been drawn to the idea of living off the grid. There was something intoxicating about the thought of disconnecting from the chaos of modern life. No traffic, no crowded streets, no endless notifications. Just me, the natural world, and the quiet. For years, I had fantasized about it, scrolling through blogs and videos of people living in tiny homes, converted vans, and remote cabins. It seemed perfect. So when I finally saved enough, I took the plunge and bought a used RV. It wasn't much to look at, just an older model with chipped paint and worn tires. But it was mine. It represented freedom, adventure, and the promise of a simpler life. After a few weeks of preparation and learning the basics of RV maintenance, I finally set off to find the perfect spot. I chose a clearing on the edge of a forest, a few miles down an old dirt trail that seemed to be used only occasionally by hikers. It was remote, peaceful, and surrounded by nature. At first, it was everything I had dreamed of. Each morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the small windows. I spent my days exploring the woods, finding hidden trails, and marveling at the beauty of the untouched wilderness. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the earthy scent of pine and moss. At night, I would settle in with a book, the soft glow of my lantern casting shadows on the RV walls. It felt like paradise, a life removed from the constant noise of the city. But then, the noises started. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Twigs snapping in the distance, leaves rustling outside. It was probably just the natural sounds of the forest. Animals live here too, I told myself. It's their home. And for a while, that explanation was enough to keep my nerves in check. But over time, the sounds grew harder to ignore. One night, I was lying in bed, the lantern turned off, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far heavier than any animal I could think of. They seemed to circle the RV, crunching the dried leaves and twigs on the ground. My heart started to race. Holding my breath, I grabbed the flashlight I kept by my bedside and crept to the window. I hesitated before looking outside. My rational mind told me it was probably just a deer, or maybe even a person passing through. But my gut told me something else. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain and shone the flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light illuminated the trees and the underbrush, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped as soon as I moved. I spent the rest of the night listening for any other sounds, but the footsteps didn't return. The next morning, I went outside to investigate. I walked around the RV, scanning the ground for tracks or any sign of what might have been out there. At first, I found nothing unusual, but then I saw the scratches. They were on the side of the RV near the door, long, deep marks that ran vertically down the metal. My stomach turned as I crouched down to inspect them. They were too high off the ground to have been made by a raccoon or a fox, and they didn't match the pattern of claws you'd expect from a bear. It looked deliberate, as though something had dragged sharp claws down the side of the vehicle with force. Panic set in as I tried to piece together what could have caused the damage. I'd done my research before moving out here and knew the area wasn't supposed to have any large predators. The nearest reports of bear sightings were miles away, and even then, they were rare. Could it have been a person? But who would go to such lengths to scratch up an RV in the middle of nowhere? And why? Despite my unease, I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. Maybe it was an animal I wasn't familiar with, or maybe someone had wandered by and played a prank. I didn't want to overreact. Still, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows that night, double-checking each one before crawling into bed. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were louder. The footsteps seemed heavier, closer, and more deliberate. I could hear them circling the RV again, just like before, but now they were accompanied by a faint, scratching sound. It was coming from the door. My chest tightened as I gripped the flashlight and knife I'd placed next to my bed after finding the scratches. I sat in silence, every muscle in my body tense, as I listened to the noise. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then there was a thud, like something or someone testing the strength of the door. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Summoning what little courage I had, I stood up and approached the door. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear whatever was outside. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't an animal noise, not a growl, not a bark. It sounded wrong. I raised the flashlight and flicked it on, then quickly unlocked the door and swung it open. The cold night air rushed in as I pointed the beam into the darkness, searching for the source of the noise. Once again, there was nothing there, but something felt off. The air was too still, too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I stepped outside, scanning the area with the flashlight. My eyes darted to the edges of the clearing, expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a quick, fleeting motion near the tree line. I turned the flashlight toward it, but whatever it was had already disappeared. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, before retreating back inside and locking the door. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My paradise was starting to feel like a trap, and the once comforting isolation now felt suffocating. Something was out there, and whatever it wasn't afraid of me. And that was the most terrifying part. I couldn't sleep. No matter how tightly I pulled the blankets around me, or how many times I tried to calm my racing mind, the noises outside wouldn't let me rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, a low growl, the crunch of leaves underfoot, or that faint, rhythmic tapping on the side of my RV. It wasn't the kind of sound you could easily ignore. It was deliberate, calculated, and far too consistent to be the wind. By midnight, I'd given up on sleep entirely. I sat on the small couch near the front of the RV, a flashlight gripped tightly in my trembling hands. My ears were straining for the faintest sound, my body tense and alert. Outside, the forest had fallen into an unnatural silence. No chirping crickets, no rustling of small animals, just the deafening quiet of anticipation. At around 2 a.m., a sound cut through the stillness that made my blood run cold. A scraping noise. It was slow, deliberate, and moving along the length of the RV, like something sharp being dragged across the metal. I held my breath, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. The flashlight felt heavier in my hand as I slowly rose from the couch, each movement feeling sluggish and weighted with fear. The scraping continued, steady and methodical, as if the thing outside wanted me to know it was there. With a trembling hand, I approached the nearest window. The blinds were drawn, but the sound was so close that it felt like the thing was just inches away. My instincts screamed at me to run, to hide, but I couldn't let this go on without seeing what I was dealing with. I reached up and carefully opened the blinds just a crack, peering into the darkness outside. What I saw was wrong. Standing in the faint glow of the moonlight was a figure. At first, I thought it might be a person. A tall, gaunt figure with unnaturally long arms that hung at its sides. Its silhouette was sharp and angular, but something about it was off. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, almost as if its neck couldn't quite support the weight of its skull. But it was its eyes that stopped me cold. They didn't look human. They reflected the beam of my flashlight like an animal's eyes would, glinting with an eerie, predatory shine. Yet the thing didn't move. It just stood there, staring directly at me, as if it had been waiting for me to look. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, unable to look away. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Was it a man? An animal? Something else entirely? My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure remained motionless, its unblinking eyes locked onto mine. It was as though it was studying me, gauging my reaction. A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized how deliberate its presence felt, like it wanted me to know it was there. I finally snapped out of my paralysis and slammed the blind shut, stumbling backward in a panic. My hands fumbled with the locks on the window as I secured them as tightly as I could, though I wasn't sure they would do much good. I retreated to the back of the RV, clutching the largest knife I had in the tiny kitchenette. My back pressed against the wall, and I sat there for hours, barely breathing, listening to every creak and groan of the RV. The scraping noise didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because I woke to the faint glow of dawn streaming through the windows. The relief I felt at seeing the sunlight was indescribable. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to breathe, but the relief was short-lived. When I finally mustered the courage to step outside, the first thing I noticed was the damage. There were scratches everywhere, not just on the side of the RV, but on the windows and even the door. They were deep and jagged, like something with claws had spent hours trying to tear its way in. My stomach churned as I ran my fingers over the marks, imagining what could have caused them. But what terrified me the most were the footprints. They started near the back of the RV and trailed off into the woods. Each print was massive, far too large to belong to any human. The shape was equally unsettling. Elongated toes that ended in sharp, claw-like points. I knelt down to get a closer look, but doing so made me feel sick. The sight of those prints filled me with a primal fear I couldn't shake. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't anything I had ever seen before. A part of me knew I should leave right then and there, pack up the RV, and drive as far away as I could. But another part of me, perhaps the same part that had led me to live out here in the first place, wanted answers. I wanted to know what was stalking me, what was out there in the woods. I told myself I could stay just one more night. I'd set up cameras, keep watch, and maybe catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But deep down, I knew this was a mistake. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It had found me, and it wasn't going to leave until it got what it wanted. I was done feeling helpless. Whatever was stalking me had turned my dream of solitude into a waking nightmare, and I wasn't going to let it win. Determined to confront it head-on, I made preparations. That evening, I set up a small campfire outside the RV. The flames cast flickering shadows across the clearing. The crackle of burning wood, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I armed myself with a hatchet, its weight in my hand, both comforting and terrifying. I figured the light and heat from the fire might deter animals, or whatever this thing was. But deep down, I knew it wasn't afraid of fire. The forest around me was dead silent, as if every living creature knew to stay hidden. The air felt heavy, charged with a tension that made it hard to breathe. I sat by the fire, every muscle in my body tense, my eyes darting between the tree line and the RV. Around midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The firelight seemed dimmer, the air colder. That's when I heard it again. Those footsteps. But this time, they weren't trying to mask their presence. Each step was deliberate, crunching the fallen leaves with purpose. I gripped the hatchet tighter, shining my flashlight into the woods. My heart pounded as the beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless trees. And then it stepped into the light. It was the same figure from the night before, but this time it was closer, much closer. My stomach churned as I took in its horrifying appearance. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its elongated limbs. The proportions of its body were all wrong. Its arms hung far too low, its legs bent backward like those of some grotesque predator. But its face was the worst part. The head cocked unnaturally to one side, its wide, animal-like eyes reflecting the firelight. It crouched low to the ground, moving slowly, like it was studying me. A guttural growl rumbled from its throat, a sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl. "Go away," I shouted, raising the hatchet and swinging it in its direction. My voice cracked with fear, but I refused to let it see how terrified I was. The thing didn't flinch. Instead, it responded with a sound, a low, distorted noise that sent shivers down my spine. It was almost like laughter, but warped and inhuman. And then it charged. The speed at which it moved was impossible. One moment it was crouching. The next, it was hurtling toward me on all fours, its limbs bending in ways no creatures should. I barely had time to react. Instinct took over, and I threw the hatchet as hard as I could, not even aiming, just hoping to slow it down. Without waiting to see if it worked, I turned and sprinted for the RV. My legs felt like lead, my chest burning as I pushed myself to move faster than I ever thought possible. The distance between the campfire and the RV felt endless, every step stretching into an eternity. I reached the RV, flinging the door open and slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, every sound outside amplified by my panic. The creature hit the side of the RV with a force that made the entire vehicle rock. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering as it began clawing at the door, its screeches filling the air. The sound was unbearable, high-pitched, guttural, and furious. The metal door groaned under the pressure as the thing tried to force its way inside. I screamed, scrambling to grab the keys from the counter. My fingers fumbled as I shoved them into the ignition, praying the RV would start. The engine roared to life, the sound drowning out the creature's relentless assault. I slammed the gas pedal. The RV lurching forward onto the uneven dirt trail. The thing outside let out a guttural roar, and I could feel the RV shaking as it chased after me. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it. Its limbs moved unnaturally fast, each step propelling it closer with terrifying precision. My breath caught as its glowing eyes locked onto me, even as the distance between us grew. Branches scraped against the sides of the RV as I sped down the trail, barely keeping control on the uneven ground. My focus was singular: get to the main road. I didn't care about the condition of the RV or the trees in my path. Survival was the only thing that mattered. Finally, I burst out of the forest and onto the paved road. The tires squealed as I turned sharply, the RV jerking violently. When I looked in the rearview mirror again, the creature was gone. The darkness of the woods swallowed it whole, leaving only the faint memory of its glowing eyes. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. When I finally pulled into a gas station parking lot, I broke down, tears streaming down my face as the adrenaline drained from my body. I never went back to that forest. I sold the RV a week later, unable to even look at it without hearing those guttural screeches or feeling the terror of that night. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I've tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light, a wild animal, maybe even a hallucination brought on by isolation. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something out there in the woods, something that doesn't belong in this world, and it found me